Chapter 1. The Handshake That Started It All. The diplomatic summit on Velmara 9 was supposed to be a simple, procedural event, nothing more than a ceremonial exchange of pleasantries between the United Galactic Coalition and the Zarathian Empire. The meeting had been in the works for months, a carefully orchestrated effort to strengthen interstellar relations and negotiate trade agreements between humanity and one of the most powerful alien empires in the sector. For Ethan Voss, a mid-level diplomat from Earth, it was supposed to be just another assignment: fly in, smile for the cameras, shake some hands, and try not to offend anyone too much. It wasn't his first time working with alien dignitaries, and it certainly wouldn't be his last. But what he didn't know, what none of the human delegates knew, was that the Zarathians had customs that were dangerously misunderstood, and he was about to become the unwitting center of an interstellar incident. The Zarathians were a proud, ancient species, their empire stretching across dozens of star systems, their technology centuries ahead of humanity's. They were humanoid in appearance but stood taller, their features sharper, their skin adorned with intricate patterns that shimmered like living tattoos. Their culture was steeped in ritual, in honor, in traditions that went back thousands of years, traditions that humanity, in all its diplomatic efforts, had failed to fully comprehend. And now, standing in the grand hall of the Zarathian Imperial Palace, Ethan was about to learn the hard way just how little humans actually knew. The moment had seemed harmless at first. The human delegation had been ushered into the vast ceremonial chamber, an architectural marvel carved from obsidian and laced with veins of glowing silver. At the far end of the chamber, upon a throne that seemed to radiate power, sat Emperor Vorix, a towering figure, his golden robes flowing like liquid light, his piercing violet eyes studying the human representatives with quiet intensity. Beside him, on a slightly smaller but no less ornate throne, sat his daughter Princess Solara. She was stunning, even by human standards. Tall and regal, with deep sapphire skin that seemed to shimmer beneath the chamber's artificial lighting. Her long silver hair braided in intricate loops, adorned with delicate crystalline ornaments that hummed faintly with energy. Her eyes, the same shade of violet as her father's, held an expression of measured curiosity, as if she were studying the humans just as much as they were studying her. Ethan had been briefed on the proper protocols before the meeting. Bow when addressed, maintain eye contact, but not for too long. Avoid direct gestures that might be considered aggressive. But there was one crucial piece of information that had apparently been left out of his training, because when Princess Solara extended her hand toward him, he did what any human would do. He shook it. The moment his fingers wrapped around hers, he felt the briefest flicker of energy, something like static electricity dancing along his skin. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but Solara's eyes widened in something that looked very much like shock. Ethan barely had time to register the shift in her expression before the entire hall fell silent. The Zarathian nobles who had been watching the proceedings with polite interest were now staring at him, their expressions frozen somewhere between disbelief and outright horror. The guards flanking the emperor tensed, their hands drifting toward the curved energy blades at their hips. Even Emperor Vorixal, who had remained composed throughout the meeting, now regarded Ethan with an intensity that made his blood run cold. Princess Solara slowly withdrew her hand, staring down at her own fingers as if they had just been marked by something irreversible. Ethan's stomach twisted. What the hell just happened? A low murmur rippled through the assembled Zarathians, their hushed voices sharp with urgency. Ethan glanced toward his own delegation, but they looked just as lost as he felt. The lead ambassador, an older man named Donovan Huxley, took a cautious step forward, clearing his throat. Is there a problem? The Emperor's gaze snapped to him, and when he spoke, his voice was like rolling thunder, carrying the weight of absolute authority. Your representative has performed the binding gesture with my daughter. Ethan blinked. The what? The Emperor's expression darkened. The handshake, Solara said, her voice quiet, yet carrying a weight that made the room seem smaller. It is not a mere greeting among my people. Ethan felt a cold sweat forming on the back of his neck. Then, what is it? For the first time since the incident, the Emperor's lips curled into something that might have been amusement, perhaps something more ominous. In our culture, the act of clasping hands between two unbonded individuals is the most sacred of rituals. It is the sign of an eternal pact, an unbreakable promise. Ethan's heartbeat hammered against his ribs. I don't understand, he said slowly. What kind of promise? Emperor Vorixal's eyes glowed faintly. Marriage. Ethan's brain short-circuited. He stared at the Emperor, then at Princess Solara, then back at the Emperor. I'm sorry. I think I misheard you. The Emperor's voice did not waver. You did not. The weight of the words crashed down on Ethan like a collapsing starship. His mind reeled, grasping for some kind of rational explanation, some way to correct this massive diplomatic misunderstanding. Zalara's expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the intensity in her gaze. My father speaks the truth, she said softly. By our laws, the binding gesture is sacred. It is the act that seals a union between two individuals, a declaration before the gods and the empire that they are to become one. Ethan's mouth went dry. He had just accidentally proposed to an alien princess. Donovan Huxley, still standing beside him, let out a choked cough. With all due respect, Your Majesty, I don't believe our representative was aware of this custom. Surely, there must be some way to dash. There is no mistake, the Emperor interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. The pact has been sealed. To break it would bring dishonor upon the royal family. His violet eyes hardened. Upon my daughter. Ethan's stomach dropped. Oh no. He turned back to Zalara, half expecting her to deny this madness, to insist that an exception could be made. But she did not. Instead, she took a slow step forward, her gaze locking onto his. If you refuse, she said quietly, you will not leave this planet alive. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The air in the chamber was heavy, thick with the weight of a tradition he had stumbled into like an idiot. His mind was still struggling to process the situation, to find some kind of logical way out. But there was no way out. Because by Zarathian law, he was now bound to Princess Solara, and whether he liked it or not, he was about to become the father of her heirs. Chapter 2. The Unwilling Groom. The weight of the declaration hung in the air like a physical force, pressing down on Ethan's chest as he stood frozen in the grand hall of the Zarathian Imperial Palace. Every instinct in his body screamed that this was a mistake, a colossal misunderstanding, something that could be negotiated away, smoothed over with the right words, the right diplomacy. But as he looked into the unblinking violet eyes of Emperor Vorixal, he realized something chilling. This was not negotiable. The Zarathians had built an empire on tradition, on sacred customs that had stood for thousands of years. Their word was law, and in their eyes, Ethan had just bound himself to the royal bloodline, whether he intended to or not. A sharp pang of anxiety shot through him, his mind scrambling for some kind of out, some loophole in their customs that would allow him to walk away from this without igniting an interstellar incident. But the silence in the room was deafening, the gathered nobles staring at him with expressions ranging from amusement to outright hostility. Princess Solara stood still, her face unreadable. She was a vision of regal control, her sapphire skin shimmering beneath the golden light of the palace. There was no hint of panic in her expression, no sign that she was as blindsided by this as he was. It was as if she had already accepted the outcome, as if she had known that the moment their hands had touched, their fates had been sealed. Ethan forced himself to breathe, to stay calm, even as his pulse thundered in his ears. Your Majesty, he said carefully, addressing the Emperor. I mean no disrespect, but in my culture, a handshake is merely a greeting, a form of respect, nothing more. Vorixal's expression remained unreadable, but the slight narrowing of his eyes made Ethan's stomach churn. It is not merely a greeting in ours, the Emperor replied. His voice was measured, heavy with finality. The binding gesture is absolute. Ethan's throat went dry. But surely, there is no surely. The Emperor's tone brooked no argument. The moment your hands touched, you became part of the Zarathian royal lineage. You are now bound to my daughter, and by extension, to our empire. This is the will of the gods, and it shall not be undone. Ethan gritted his teeth, his mind spinning in circles. This was insanity. He couldn't just be forced into marriage because of a handshake. There had to be a way out of this. He turned to Zalara, praying that she might be willing to intervene, to argue on his behalf, to explain that there was some kind of exception. But instead, She studied him with a look that made his stomach twist in ways he didn't fully understand. "There is no reversing a binding gesture," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was something beneath it, something deeper. "To refuse now would bring great dishonor, not only to my house but to my people." Ethan felt a cold sweat creeping up his spine. "Wait, wait, wait," he said, raising his hands as if that would somehow stop the runaway starship of a situation he had found himself on. "I get that this is a serious thing for your people, but where I come from, marriage isn't just something that happens by accident." The nobles murmured among themselves, some clearly offended by his words, others watching with thinly veiled amusement, as if they were enjoying his discomfort. The emperor tilted his head slightly, regarding Ethan with a gaze that felt like it could see straight through him. "You are concerned about the permanence of this union," he mused, his tone oddly calculating. Ethan opened his mouth to answer, but before he could, the emperor continued. "I understand that humans value choice," Vorexal said, "and though the binding gesture is sacred, I am not without reason." For a brief, hopeful moment, Ethan's heart leapt. Was the emperor giving him a way out? But then Vorexal smiled, and Ethan knew he had just made a terrible assumption. "I will grant you one opportunity," the emperor said, his violet eyes gleaming. "You will spend one cycle *** 30 days in our time *** as my daughter's consort. You will live as one of us, you will learn our ways, and if, at the end of this period, you truly believe you cannot uphold this sacred bond, then I will allow you to walk away." The relief Ethan had barely begun to feel was immediately crushed beneath the weight of that last sentence. Because the way the emperor had said it, the way the gathered Zarathians reacted it, told him everything he needed to know. No one walked away from a binding gesture. Not alive, anyway. Zalara turned to him, her expression still composed, but there was something behind her eyes now. Something like curiosity. "The challenge has been set," she said. "You will live as my betrothed. You will be tested, measured. If you fail, it will not be me who decides your fate." Ethan clenched his jaw, trying to rein in his frustration. "So if I don't pass this test, what happens?" The emperor's smile was cold. "Then you will be considered unworthy." Ethan swallowed hard. "And what happens to people who are considered unworthy?" The emperor's smile did not fade. "They do not leave Zarathian soil." A cold chill settled over Ethan. So that was it. This wasn't just about honor. This was about proving himself. And if he failed, he was never leaving this planet alive. The tension in the chamber was so thick it felt like gravity had doubled. Ethan felt every Zarathian noble's eyes boring into him, waiting for his response. There was no way out of this. No quick escape. No clever words that could undo what had already been done. So he did the only thing he could. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and met the emperor's gaze head-on. "I accept," he said, his voice steady, despite the sheer insanity of the situation. A murmur rippled through the nobles. Some seemed impressed. Others merely watched with thinly veiled amusement. The emperor nodded. "Then it is decided." He gestured to Zalara. "You will stay in my daughter's private quarters. She will determine how best to prepare you for the trials ahead." Ethan turned to Zalara, whose expression had not changed, but he could see something in her gaze that hadn't been there before. A challenge. And something else. Something he did not understand yet. As the guards moved to escort him to his new fate, Ethan felt the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. 30 days. 30 days to survive. 30 days to prove himself worthy of a throne he never asked for. Or 30 days to fail and disappear forever. Either way, his life was never going to be the same again. Chapter 3. The Trials of a Future King. Ethan sat in stunned silence as the Zarathian guards led him through the winding, towering corridors of the palace. The walls shimmered with embedded crystals that pulsed faintly, casting a soft, ethereal glow that made the obsidian architecture feel alive, as if the palace itself was watching him. Every step he took echoed, the sound swallowed by the weight of the unspoken expectations pressing down on him. He had gone from being a diplomat of the United Galactic Coalition to an unwilling consort of an alien princess, a future king in name only, his fate hanging by a thread thinner than a molecule of graphene. 30 days. 30 days to prove he was worthy of Princess Zalara's hand. 30 days to survive whatever trials the Emperor had in store for him. 30 days to navigate the most dangerous situation he had ever found himself in, because if he failed, he wouldn't just be walking away empty-handed. He wouldn't be walking away at all. As they entered a vast, open chamber, the ceiling arching high above like the ribcage of a celestial beast, Ethan caught sight of Princess Zalara standing at the center of the room, waiting for him. She was clad in royal battle attire, a flowing ensemble of sapphire and silver, the fabric interwoven with delicate metallic strands that shifted like liquid under the light. At her hip, a ceremonial blade rested, its hilt pulsing with energy, as if responding to its wielder's emotions. Her gaze flickered to him, assessing, cold, yet not unkind. Ethan swallowed hard. "This is your first test," Zalara announced, her voice calm but carrying the weight of command. He blinked. "We just got here. You will learn quickly that time is not wasted in Zarathian culture," she said, stepping forward. The guards moved to encircle the chamber, their weapons resting at their sides, but their presence was not simply for show. If Ethan made one wrong move, he had no doubt they would cut him down without hesitation. He exhaled. "All right. What's the first test?" Zalara's eyes gleamed. "Survival." Without warning, she lunged. Ethan barely had time to react as she unsheathed her blade in a blur of movement, the edge stopping mere inches from his throat. He stumbled back, heart pounding, but his instincts kicked in just in time to dodge the follow-up strike aimed at his ribs. "What the hell, Dash?" He barely ducked under the next slash. "This is the first lesson you must learn," Zalara said, her tone even measured, as if she weren't trying to cut him in half. "A future king cannot afford to hesitate." Ethan cursed under his breath. He had received basic combat training as part of his diplomatic preparation, but he had never expected to be put in a life-or-death duel with an alien princess on the first day of his unwilling engagement. He sidestepped, narrowly avoiding the strike aimed for his shoulder, and instinctively reached for one of the short, curved training swords lined along the chamber wall. The moment his fingers wrapped around the hilt, Zalara's stance shifted. "Good," she murmured before attacking again. Ethan had no time to think. He blocked, the clash of their blades sending vibrations up his arm, the force behind her strike far stronger than he expected. She was testing him, but that didn't mean she was holding back. Every move she made was designed to assess, to evaluate, to measure his worth in the most brutal way possible. She was fast, faster than any opponent he had ever faced. But he had one advantage: he had spent years negotiating with alien species, studying their movements, their customs, their strengths and weaknesses. And right now, he needed every ounce of that knowledge to survive. She went for an overhead strike. He sidestepped, redirected the momentum. She spun, transitioning into a low sweeping cut, but he saw the shift in her balance and dodged just in time. A flicker of approval crossed her face. "You learn quickly," she said. Ethan didn't answer. He was too busy trying to stay alive. She attacked again, and this time, he countered. The clash of metal rang through the chamber, and for a brief moment, they were locked in a battle of wills, blades pressed together, their gazes locked. Then, with a swift motion, Zalara disengaged, stepping back. She sheathed her blade with a single fluid motion, her expression unreadable. Ethan exhaled, his muscles aching, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. Zalara regarded him for a long moment before speaking. "You are better than I expected," she admitted. Ethan gave a tired chuckle. "I'll take that as a compliment. The trials will not be this easy." His amusement faded instantly. "You call that easy?" Zalara's expression didn't change. "If you fail," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "they will not hesitate to kill you." The weight of her words settled over him like a storm cloud. This wasn't just a formality. It was a battle for survival. The weight of a throne. Ethan spent the next few days training relentlessly under Zalara's watchful gaze. The trials weren't just tests of combat, they were tests of endurance, intelligence, leadership, and adaptability. He was thrown into harsh simulations, forced to navigate through dangerous terrain while being pursued by Zarathian warriors. He was subjected to mental tests, where he had to solve complex strategic problems in front of Zarathian generals, proving he had the intellect to lead. He was even tested in diplomatic warfare, where Zarathian nobles attempted to manipulate him into breaking imperial laws, to see if he was sharp enough to outmaneuver them. Through it all, Zalara watched. She never intervened, never offered him an easy way out. But she studied him with a gaze that was less cold, less distant than before. And slowly, something between them began to shift. It was in the way she spoke to him, in the way her sharp remarks softened slightly, in the way she stood closer than necessary when they walked through the palace halls. Ethan saw it too. He wasn't just another outsider being tested. He was someone she was beginning to understand. And that terrified him, because despite the insanity of his situation, despite the impossible circumstances, he was starting to see her not just as the princess who had been forced upon him, but as someone real, someone with burdens of her own. And if he wasn't careful, he would start caring. But there was no room for hesitation. The final trial was approaching, and failure was not an option. Chapter 4. The Final Trial and the Choice That Changes Everything. The palace courtyard had been transformed into a coliseum of judgment, towering spires casting shadows over the assembled crowd of Zarathian nobles, warriors, and high-ranking officials. The air was thick with anticipation, the hum of energy weapons barely restrained, the tension palpable as the last trial of the binding ceremony was about to begin. Ethan stood at the center, the entire empire watching him, his muscles aching from days of rigorous training, his mind sharpened by relentless challenges that had tested not only his survival but his ability to lead. He was no longer just a diplomat stranded in an impossible situation. He was now a contender for the throne of Zarathia, a title he had never wanted but was being forced to earn nonetheless. At the far end of the Colosseum, seated upon a massive throne elevated above the arena floor, was Emperor Vorixal, his piercing violet eyes locked onto Ethan. Beside him, Princess Zalara stood rigid, her sapphire skin glowing beneath the ethereal light of the ceremonial flames that burned along the edges of the grand platform. She had been watching him differently these past few days, not with the cold, calculating gaze she had held when they first met, not with the detached interest of someone observing an outsider, but with something more complex, more weighted, more uncertain. And that terrified Ethan more than any of the trials he had endured so far, because he was starting to see her differently too. But there was no time to dwell on that now, because the final trial was about to begin. A Zarathian general, clad in ceremonial armor etched with glowing inscriptions of past victories, stepped forward and addressed the gathered audience. The last test of the binding ceremony shall commence. His voice rang out like a war drum, each word resonating through the courtyard. The human must now prove his worth in the trial of dominion. Ethan inhaled sharply. He had heard whispers of this test from the palace guards, but none had been willing to elaborate on its specifics. All he knew was that no outsider had ever reached this stage before, let alone succeeded. The general continued, his gaze settling on Ethan with thinly veiled disdain. The trial of dominion is the ultimate test of leadership. A ruler must not only possess strength but also the mind to command, the will to break their enemies, and the wisdom to know when to show mercy. The human will face an opponent of our choosing, a test of both combat and strategy. If he fails, the crowd murmured, he dies. Ethan gritted his teeth. Of course, everything had led to this moment. The emperor raised his hand, and the entire courtyard fell silent. His voice, when it came, was smooth, powerful, and absolute. Bring forth the challenger. A heavy metal gate rumbled open on the far side of the arena, chains clanking as something massive emerged from the darkness beyond. Ethan's stomach clenched. The creature that stepped into the light was a Zarathian war beast, standing nearly 10 feet tall, its black armored hide rippling with unnatural strength, its eyes glowing a deep, predatory crimson. In its hands, it carried a massive energy spear, its edge crackling with raw power. It wasn't just a warrior. It was a gladiator bred for battle, a living executioner, the kind of opponent that did not leave survivors. Ethan swallowed hard. Of course, it wouldn't be just a simple duel. It would be a spectacle, the kind the Zarathians craved, a fight to prove whether an outsider was worthy of standing among them. He could feel Zalara watching him, but he didn't dare meet her gaze. This was it. This was where it ended one way or another. The war beast let out a guttural roar, slamming the butt of its spear against the ground, sending a shockwave through the sand. The general raised his hand. Begin. The war beast charged. Ethan had no time to think. He barely dodged as the spear came down like a meteor, the impact shattering the ground where he had stood just seconds before. The force of it sent him tumbling backward, sand kicking up into his face, his pulse hammering in his ears. He rolled, barely avoiding the follow-up strike. The beast moving impossibly fast for its size, its movements calculated, efficient, brutal. Ethan wasn't a warrior. Not in the way the Zarathians were. But he was a survivor. And if he wanted to leave this arena alive, he needed to outthink his opponent. Not fight it head-on. Outmaneuver it. He shifted his stance, forcing himself to watch the war beast's movements, to analyze its rhythm. It was fast, but its strikes were predictable, powerful, yes, but reliant on brute strength over agility. Ethan could use that. The next time the spear came down, he sidestepped at the last second, moving just fast enough that the impact cracked the ground beside him but missed his body entirely. He moved again, constantly staying just out of reach, forcing the beast to keep swinging, keep expending energy. It roared in frustration. Good. It was getting reckless. He just needed one opening. One chance. Then it came. The war beast overextended, its spear burying itself into the ground for a fraction of a second. And Ethan acted. He lunged, grabbing one of the discarded blades from the ground, and slammed it into the warbeast's exposed side, right between the overlapping plates of its armor. The beast howled in pain, staggering. Ethan didn't stop. He twisted the blade deeper, wrenching it sideways, sending a spray of luminescent blood across the sand. The creature shuddered. Then it collapsed. For a long, breathless moment, the entire courtyard was silent. Then, a single voice rose from the stands. A slow, deliberate clap. Ethan turned his head. It was the Emperor. The nobles followed suit, their murmurs a mix of astonishment and approval, some clearly displeased, others genuinely impressed. Zalara was smiling, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Ethan let himself breathe. A choice that changes everything. The trial was over. Ethan had one, and now, he faced his final choice. The Emperor stood before him, his violet eyes holding an expression Ethan had not seen before, something like respect. "You have proven yourself," the Emperor declared. "You have fought, endured, and survived. You have upheld the binding gesture and earned the right to rule at my daughter's side." The crowd cheered, but Ethan barely heard it. Because this was it. This was where he could walk away. The Emperor had promised that if he succeeded, he would be given the choice. He could leave Zarathia, go home, pretend this never happened. But then, he looked at Zalara, and something inside him shifted. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about her. About the way she had challenged him, tested him, believed in him when no one else did. And the realization hit him like a starship crash. He didn't want to leave. He took a breath, looked the Emperor in the eye, and said the words that sealed his fate forever. "I stay." Zalara's breath caught. And just like that, Ethan Voss, human diplomat, had just become the future king of Zarathia.